Well, let's analyse then that situation in Algeria and bring in William Lawrence, a professor at George Washington University and an expert on North African politics. Good afternoon to you. Thanks very much for talking to us on France 24 today. What do you make of the chances that these protesters could be successful and that they could actually manage to stop Bouteflika from seeking that fifth term in office?
Well, that's certainly not what the Algerian authorities want, but it is possible for a couple of reasons. First, these are the largest anti-Bouteflika protests ever, and some of the largest protests we've seen in Algeria since 1991. Second of all, there are some reports coming out of Switzerland where the president was whisked off to, for they said scheduled medical treatment, but I didn't notice that it had been scheduled. But the president is in Switzerland and quite ill. And so if the Algerian regime was looking for a chance to say, okay, well, maybe we're going to take a change of course, the president has fallen more ill than he was before, this would be the opportunity. The most important thing is how many people turn out today. They've called for a 1 million-man march. I don't think we'll get to 1 million, but we've had protests over the last week in 30 Algerian cities and towns, including the largest cities, and despite a protest ban in Algiers. And it seems like the logjam's been broken a little, that Algerians who are afraid to protest are starting to come out, and this could put more pressure on the establishment.
Now, you mentioned then that these are the largest protests we've seen in Algeria since the 90s. Now, we know Bouteflika has been unwell for a long time, suffering a stroke in 2013. Why is it that we've seen so few public protests against his rule until now?
There's a number of reasons. First of all, most protests in Algeria is what we call micro-protests. There are over 11,000 micro-protests a year, usually about jobs or health or education benefits. And so Algerians are used to protesting, but not in large numbers, because both the regime and the population believe this is destabilizing. That's why the prime minister said in his speech yesterday that this could be like Syria. He's trying to hit the notes of concern that all Algerians have, that they would go back to a violent situation like in the 1990s. But most of these protesters weren't even born during the first Arab Spring in Algeria in the late 80s. And the time has come in the eyes of many young Algerians to finally stand up, as previous generations did, against existing powers, and to take charge, to be dignified, to stand up against the government. And so I do expect a rather large protest now, larger than we've seen in 10 or 20 years.
What about the role of the former colonial power, France, in all of this? Do you think they've been particularly vocal in this crisis?
No, and they rarely are, and for a lot of reasons, including how tightly knitted together the Algerian and the French populations are. I mean, a percentage of France is of Algerian origin, maybe 6%. It's a huge number. And the French government spends most of its time dealing with bilateral issues. They did recall their ambassador on Wednesday for consultations, and both the French government and the Algerian government were very surprised by the amplitude of the protests over the last week. So certainly the French government is preparing for all eventualities.
You mentioned before then the Prime Minister referencing what happened in Syria. Do you think those comparisons with the Arab Spring are likely to deter people from going out into the streets?
No, because there's a much better example, Tunisia next door. And for all of the problems that Tunisia's had in recent years, particularly economically, Algerians are keenly aware that they got the democracy that Algeria never got. And in fact, during the crisis of the 2016-17 period, because all the tourism disappeared in Tunisia after the terrorist attacks, over 1 million Algerians a year were crossing into Tunisia in an act of solidarity to boost the Tunisian success. And so I think most Algerians are more willing to make a Tunisia comparison rather than a Syria comparison.
What do you make of how the press has covered this story? We've seen some challenges with at least the Algerian media being able to cover some of these protests.
It's very unusual for state media presenters to be so vocal. We've had a resignation, we've had protests, we've had dozens of journalists arrested in the street yesterday. This is unusual for Algeria, which considers one of the few major accomplishments of what came out of the late 80s, early 90s, was an opening up of the press. And the Algerian press is relatively free in certain regards, but this clampdown of coverage of these very protests is not only making the population angrier because they're not getting covered, but they're making the journalists angrier. So I expect to see further turbulence in the journalism sector in Algiers over the coming days.
William Lawrence talking to us there from George Washington University. Thank you very much for your analysis and for your thoughts as those protests do slowly begin to get underway in Algeria this afternoon, and we're watching them closely.